Reb, if you wanted me to sing a solo, you got to tell me in advance. All right, for those of you who have been here and for those of you who haven't been here, we've been going through the Old Testament, discussing those important stories that every believer ought to know. We've been in the section of Israel's history when they had kings. But it wasn't a solid kingdom at this point because God's people, Israel, have divided into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and they each have their own sets of kings. Last week we looked at two prophets who prophesied and did miracles during the reign of some of these kings. And we discussed the purpose of these miracles. And it was to prove to the people that the prophet really did speak for God. How do we know that you're speaking for God? Well, watch, I'll perform a miracle by the power of God. Moses asked this question at the burning bush when he was asked by God to go back into Egypt and get his people out. Well, they're going to say, how do we know that God sent you over here? And God gave him some miracles to perform. Now, why is that important? Well, much to the dismay of what those TV preachers would like you to believe, God performing miracles through individuals. God has always been performing miracles. But God performing miracles through individuals has been limited to a very, very short period in human history. In fact, there were 4 periods that add up to just a little over 100 years, but each time God reinforced his message with miracles. It meant exclusion from the land for Israel that God had promised to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Exclusion followed each one of these periods of miracles. And there are 4 main periods, and we look at the people and the product just by way of review. Moses, just a short period, 40 years, God performed miracles through his messenger, Moses. Did the people listen? No. What was the result? They were excluded from the land and ended up wandering around the wilderness for 40 years. Fast forward a few hundred years, and then there's a couple of other individuals. For a period of 40 or 50 years, Elijah and Elisha, his successor, God performs miracles through these messengers because his message to Israel, who is now in the land, is if you don't shape up, you're going to get out of the land. Now, God had already been telling them this through prophets. And he turns up the volume a little bit by reinforcing that message with miracles, and the people still didn't. And the miracles are showing the people, one, that God cares, because some of these miracles are beneficial to the people of God. But he's also showing them that God has the power to drive them out of the land. And what did it result in? He drove them out of the land for 70 years. Fast forward a few hundred years later, and the next individuals that are performing miracles are Jesus and the apostles. And this was only a 30-year period of miracles that God was doing through individuals. Again, it's all related to God's people because Jews demand signs, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 1. And did the Jews listen? No, they did not. And what happened? 70 AD happened when the Roman Empire came down into Jerusalem and destroyed the city and the temple. And guess what? The Jews were once again expelled or excluded from the land. We have one more period of God performing miracles through individuals that's coming in the future. And it's after Israel is allowed to build a temple over there. And God will set up two witnesses who resemble Moses and Elijah and may actually be Moses and Elijah. And guess what? God performs miracles through these individuals. And what are they telling the people who live in the land of Israel? Guys, you have made a treaty with this Antichrist fella. And he is going to turn his back on you and he's going to betray you. You need to shape up and stop following him. Did they listen? No. After 3.5 years of their ministry, Antichrist rides into town. He kills these two guys, and then he goes into the temple, right into the Holy of Holies, and says, I'm God. Worship me. And the Jews know this is bad because Daniel prophesied that this was going to happen. And Jesus warns Israel, at least his disciples, in Matthew chapter 24. When you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet, if you're up on the roof, don't go down in the house to get your cell phone or your slippers. Run for your lives. And once more, Israel is excluded from the land and they have to flee to the wilderness just so they can survive. So why is it important that we pay attention, at least for the Jews? Because exclusion followed each one of these miracles. Now, just a list of the miracles performed by Elijah and Elisha. Man, that's a lot of miracles. They're probably just the ones that we know about. Some of these miracles had to do with nature. For instance, Elijah prayed that there would be no water for 3.5 years. Wow. A miracle that included rain. Oh, Jesus stopped a severe storm with just a word right in the middle of it. And there's no more wind and no more rain. So, both Elijah and Elisha fed people with just a little bit. But it's nothing like what Jesus did. Jesus, on 2 occasions, with an amount of food that amounted to a lunch, fed thousands. Each of these prophets, Elijah and Elisha, raised a person from the dead. Jesus raised at least 3 people from the dead. Elisha hears the Syrians' war plans from hundreds of miles away. Jesus reads people's thoughts constantly. The Syrian army was unblinded. How many people that were blind did Jesus give them sight? One of them, at least one of them, a blind man from birth. And when Elisha died and somebody was thrown in his grave, he came to life. What happened when Jesus was put in his tomb? Lots of people came out of the graves and appeared to many. Jesus is greater than the combination of Elijah and Elisha. All right. So, Elisha also healed Naaman's leprosy, which is the story that we read this morning. Jesus healed 10 lepers at one time. He healed lots of lepers. One of them he even touched. You weren't supposed to go near a leper because they were unclean. All right. The story that we read this morning happens during the reign of Joram or Jehoram, who was the son of Ahab, the evilest king that Israel had. And Ahaziah was Ahab's son. But he died, and he didn't have a son to take his place, so his brother, also a son of Ahab, Jehoram, is now king. And he's not as bad as his father Ahab, but he's not a real good king. Now, there's the southern kingdom, Judah, in orange, and the green is the northern kingdom. And Elijah and Elisha were prophets primarily in the northern kingdom. And during the days of their prophecy, Syria, which is up there northeast of Israel, has been attacking and conducting raids on the northern kingdom and stealing their property, their possessions, and their people. They would come in to a village and they would kill the men, and they would take the women and the children, and they would sell them for slaves or take them for concubines or wives. So, Naaman, the commander of the army of Syria, are they friends with Israel? No, they are the enemy. Was a great man with his master. Who's his master? His master is the king of Syria, and in high favor, and don't miss this, folks, because by him, Yahweh, the God of Israel, had given victory to Syria. He had given victory to Syria over his own people. We're God's special people. He's supposed to take care of us. Why wasn't he? Because they had worshiped Baal. Because they had worshiped Yahweh by bowing down to 2 golden calves. And so God promised them for centuries, I will bring your enemies against you, and I will give them victory. And Israel knew this, and they still did not stop. Have you been struggling with things in your life? And God keeps bringing consequences, and you just say, well, I'm just going to continue to do it anyway? Well, that's the picture of Israel. That's what's going on. He was a mighty man of valor, except one thing, he was a leper. That means he had leprosy. He's not half the man he used to be. I didn't say that. All right, this is our picture of leprosy. And folks, this is a modern picture. Leprosy has not been eradicated. It is very prevalent over in India, of all places in the world, but we also have leprosy here in the United States. I think about 150 new cases every year. And it is called Hansen's disease. And it is a disease that attacks primarily the nervous system. They lose feeling in the extremities, like their feet and their hands. And tissue deteriorates everywhere. If you take a look at that guy, he's missing some teeth, missing some hair. Maybe I've got leprosy. He's missing an eye. And look at his fingers. They're nubs. What happens is when they lose feeling and they get an injury, sometimes because of an infection and its inability to heal, they will lose fingers and toes or worse. He could be standing there talking to you, leaning on the stove, and the burner could be on, and maybe he won't feel it. You understand what leprosy is? Now, leprosy, in the United States anyway, is connected to an adorable little creature. This is the armadillo, here known affectionately as possum on the half shell. When we were kids, we would go out in the woods and in the fields, and we would go exploring all day long, and if we found a dead animal, we just had to play with it. We would cut it up if we had a pocket knife. We did all sorts of bad things. We even threw dead animals at each other. Folks, stay away from armadillos, because armadillos carry Hansen's disease, and you don't want to end up looking like Larry the leper over there on the left. But when the Bible talks about leprosy, it may be inclusive of Hansen's disease, like just the fellow that you see up there, but it is also a general reference to any skin condition, whether it's chronic or acute. That means it lasts a long time and is contagious, or it's just a short period of rash. Now, how do I know that Naaman did not have Hansen's disease? Because he was a warrior, and he would not be able to wield the sword in an effective way if he were losing feeling in his hands. So he probably has a leprosy that more resembles this cute little girl, probably just a scaly skin condition. But it was an embarrassment to him and his family, and even as successful as he was as a general, naturally he wanted to get rid of this condition. So, back to our story. The Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. Naaman the general would have his pick of the prize, or the booty, as we would say, and he took this little girl home from one of his raids. And he says, she would make a fine servant to my wife. She said to her mistress, I wish that my master Naaman was dead. She doesn't say that, does she? She says to her mistress, who is Naaman's wife, if only my lord Naaman were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he could cure him of his leprosy. Now, folks, put yourself in this little girl's place. If she were any older, like a teenager, she probably would have been given to somebody as somebody's wife or concubine. So she's probably around 10 or 11 years old. She probably witnessed her father being murdered in one of the raids. She probably was torn out of the arms of her mother, watched her mother get sold to a different family as a slave or a wife, and now she is hundreds of miles from her home in Samaria, and she is not bitter. What did God tell Abraham? He says, Abe, I'm going to bless you, and I am going to make you and your descendants a blessing to everybody else. This girl got taught right, and she knew that the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were to be blessings even to their enemies. And she doesn't want the worst for Naaman. She wants Naaman to be healed of this. She wants him to experience the goodness of our God. And folks, we've got to stop and examine our lives of the people that we look down upon or that have done us wrong. Do we also want them to experience the goodness of our God? Examine our hearts. So Naaman went in and told his lord. Who's his lord? That's the king of Syria. And the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. Folks, they are not pen pals. They are not pals of any kind. They are technically at war because the king of Syria is making the country of Israel smaller and smaller as he takes more and more property and people. So Naaman went, taking with him 10 talents of silver. That's just a measurement, a weight of silver. 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 festal garments. He loaded up the equivalent of 10 tuxedos. And some people have estimated that this treasure is worth about $4.5 million. And that wouldn't be surprising that the king of Assyria's chief of staff was that rich, because whenever soldiers attacked a place, they took all of the possessions and all of the people that were valuable to them. And guess who had first pick? The chief of staff. So it wouldn't surprise me if he were actually that rich. So he heads over to Israel. And what does that letter say? Well, the letter says, when this letter reaches you, you know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of leprosy. So you can imagine how the king feels. He's thinking, man, this guy is just trying to stir up trouble so that I'll come out and do battle with him so he can defeat me again. He's seeking a quarrel with me. I don't have the power to cure anybody's leprosy. So while he's moaning about this, and why did people tear their clothes? Because they were in anguish. Either they lost a loved one, or things were going very badly for them, or they were facing imminent trouble. And the king has torn his garments, and Elisha hears about it. And when he heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him," that is Naaman, "come down to me." Why? So that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. And what's important about that? Because if the prophet can validate his ministry with a miracle, that means that God that he serves must be powerful, and in this case, he must be good. And that this God wants all people to repent and to come to know the knowledge of the truth. Because if this God would do this even for one of his enemies, what kind of God does Israel serve? That's amazing. When you get up in the morning, do you say, how can my life and my language convince somebody that our God exists and that he is good? That's Elisha's mission. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots, so he didn't come alone. And he halted at the door, or really the gate of Elisha's house. Why? He's respectful. He knows Israel's law concerning the leper. The leper was not allowed in the city. You were not allowed to have contact with somebody who had leprosy because it was contagious. And when they walked down the street and you were walking down the street outside of the city, they had to call out in advance, "Unclean, unclean," so you could walk a wide circle around the leper. And Naaman halts at the gate because he doesn't want to impose upon Elisha. And sure enough, Elisha sends a messenger out to him saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." Well, we know that Naaman does not respond to this very well. He gets angry and he goes away saying, "Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me. I'm a great general. And stand and call on the name of Yahweh, his God, and wave his hand all over the place and cure the leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all of the rivers or the waters of Israel?" And folks, I have seen the Jordan River in the very northern part, and I have seen the Jordan River down near where he's talking about. And there's a difference. It's really clear up in the north. But when you get down there between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, it's pretty muddy. Could I not just wash in my own rivers and be clean? And he turned and went away in a rage. Now I'm assuming that all of you in here pray. And that you pray not just for yourselves, but that you pray for people that you love. I spend anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes lying awake in my bed in the morning praying for certain people before I get out of bed. And sometimes that's very difficult because I have to go to the bathroom. One of the people that I pray for is our son, from whom we have not heard in 9 years. And I pray for his salvation and that God would bring him back to his family. And then I tell God how to do it. Oh, I've had all sorts of suggestions for God. I said, "God, please save one of his friends and show Evan your transforming power in one of his friends." I've also told God, "God, make one of his superior officers," he's in the Air Force, "take a liking to him and invite him into his home so he can see what a Christian home is really like." I tell God how I think that he ought to do his job. And Naaman had some expectations about how God ought to heal him. And when it wasn't as spectacular as he expected, because he's used to a lot of pomp and circumstance as the general, he goes away angry. But he has some servants who like him. And his servants came near and said to him, "My father." My father? That's not a servant-master terminology. That's a term of endearment. They like this guy. My father, if the prophet had commanded you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? How much rather than if he says to you something simple like, "Wash and be clean"? So Naaman went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. He trusted the word, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Wow. So I want you to know that where Elisha is over in Samaria is way over here, and the Jordan River is here, and Syria is up here. So Naaman has come all the way down here, hundreds of miles. And then he sends him back up a number of miles back to the Jordan River on his way home. And now, because of gratitude, guess what he does? Turns around and heads right back to where Elisha is. And so he returned to the man of God, he and his company, and he came and he stood before him, because he can stand before him now because he's clean of his leprosy. And he says, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." Folks, that is a statement of conversion. Everybody in those days was polytheistic. They believed that there was more than one God. And they just chose their favorite God to worship. But this statement of conversion says, no, there's only one real God, and he's the God that's in Israel. And I know that. That's a statement of conversion. And so he offers Elisha a reward, and Elisha turns it down. And so Naaman says, "I've got a couple of requests. First of all, I need as much earth, Israel dirt, as I can take back with me and load up on 2 mules. Why? Because as far as he's concerned, the real God exists in the land of Israel. And if I can't move to the land of Israel, I'll move the land of Israel over to where I live. Now, is this a weird way of thinking? Yeah. But it reflects devotion to Yahweh, as weird as it is. And so he gets earth and he takes it back to where he lives. And there's another matter. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon. That's one of the gods that they worshipped over there in Syria. Leaning on my arm, because this is what happens. This was the custom. When the king went into Rimmon's temple, he took his general with him, and he leaned on his arm. And when the king went down to bow down, the general had to go down too. And he knows that he's going to die unless he does this. And Elisha says, go in peace. In other words, the Lord will pardon this. See, he's worried about pleasing the Lord, a sign of true conversion. All right, are we done with Naaman? No. Let's skip forward a few hundred years. There is a man who has been in the ministry for a solid year. And he's been doing miracles as well. And he decides to pay a visit to his hometown, and he goes to the synagogue where all of his friends and family and all of his neighbors are attending on the day of the Sabbath. And this Jesus came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And he went to the synagogue, as was his custom on a Sabbath day. He always went to a synagogue. And the custom of synagogues in those days is that if you were known as a teacher and you attended the synagogue, they gave you an opportunity to get up and preach the message. And so Jesus is asked, and he stood up to read. And there was given to him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And he opened the book and found the place where it was written. Now, you can find this story in Luke chapter 4, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put Isaiah's words up there. And Jesus probably had the passage memorized, and he probably held the scroll like this, because it's not a book. They had scrolls. But he probably looked everybody in the eye, and he probably emphasized certain words. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news, or good news to the afflicted, or to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. You see, there's more to that Isaiah verse, but that's where Jesus stopped reading. To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And this is Jubilee language. Do you know what happened in the year of Jubilee? Any Israelite who had been sold into slavery and bought by another Israelite, he was automatically set free. And his property was restored to him. And everything went back to the way that it used to be. And all of his debts are forgiven him. This is the Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor. And that's where Jesus stops reading. And he closed the book, or the scroll, and he gave it back to the attendant, and he sat down. Folks, I like that. In the synagogue, all the people stood, and the teacher sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Now, all of the people in the synagogue were familiar with this passage, and they knew that it pertained to the long-awaited Messiah. And what Jesus is telling them is that the long-awaited Messiah has come. This has been fulfilled, at least part of it. What part of it had not been fulfilled? The day of vengeance of our God. Has God come and destroyed Israel's enemies? Has he set up the kingdom for Israel and done all this for Israel? No, he has not. Because the first time he came was not when he does that. He does that when he comes again. That's the day of vengeance of our God. Joel writes about it in his book. He calls it the day of the Lord, when God wreaks vengeance on the earth and upon all of his enemies. But that part has not been fulfilled, but that's the part that the Israeli people were most looking forward to in Jesus' time, because they were sick of Gentile and enemy domination. From the time of Daniel, they had been possessed and inhabited and mistreated and taxed by the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and now the dreaded Roman Empire. And they wanted the Messiah to come and rid them of that yoke of slavery and to free them from that domination and to give them vengeance over their enemies. But Jesus' sermon did not reflect that that was what the Messiah came to do, at least on this visit. And he said to them, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his own country. But in truth I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3.5 years, and there came a great famine over all the land. And Elijah was not sent to any of the widows in Israel." Why? Because they needed no help? Oh, they needed help. "But only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And remember, he asked her for a drink of water and for something to eat. And she says, all I've got's a little flour and a little oil, and I'm about to make my last meal so that my son and I can eat it and then just starve to death. But that oil and flour never ran out. And God kept that widow and her son alive for the 3.5 years of the famine. Couldn't he have done that with a widow in Israel? Wow. Oh, and there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha. And none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. You mean Elisha could have healed some lepers in Israel? And he ends up healing Naaman the Syrian? Ooh. But that's a Bible story. And they all knew the story, but they get mad at him anyway. When they heard this, everybody in the synagogue was filled with wrath. And they rose up and put him out of the city, and they led him to the brow of the hill on which their city was built, that they might throw him headlong. And I can promise you this. If you've been to Nazareth, Nazareth is, when we were in the bus, we were like this the whole time. I mean, it is a hill. And going around the corners and going up the hill and down the hill, you had to hold on. It is like being built on a cliff. So there were plenty of places to throw Jesus off a cliff if they wanted to. Why were these Jews so angry? Why? Because they hated Gentiles. They hated anybody who wasn't a Jew. The Gentiles, the times of the Gentiles started when God threw them out of the land for the 70-year captivity. And to this very day, Gentiles have great influence over the land of Israel. And the Jews in Jesus' time resented it very much, and they wanted God to get them out from underneath the yoke of slavery. And they thought that they, God's people Israel, we're the chosen people, we're entitled to God's mercy. A widow from the country that introduced Baal worship to Israel is not entitled to God's mercy. You know that widow that Elijah fed? She lived up in Sidon. And guess who came from Sidon? Jezebel. And Jezebel introduced an in-your-face type of Baal worship. And God was very displeased with Israel because of it. And yet these Jews who don't know anything about how to interpret the Bible or God are faulting God because he had mercy on a Gentile, an enemy of Israel, instead of Israel. Because what was Israel doing? Were they behaving themselves? No. They too were worshiping Baal, just like their enemies, and they were worshiping Yahweh by bowing down to 2 golden calves. A soldier from the country that was at war with Israel, Syria, Naaman, is not entitled to God's mercy, but we Jews, we are. You know why Naaman and the Syrians were getting victory over Israel? Because Israel was unfaithful to God. Friends, have you ever looked out and seen people that don't like you or that you don't like, or who have done evil to you or to people that you love, and God is blessing them, and you think in your heart, they don't deserve that. But I do. I'm guilty of that. Who does get God's mercy? Well, Jesus tells us there when he quotes Isaiah chapter 61, in Luke chapter 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. What is this? The financially disadvantaged? No. We know what Jesus means by poor because he explains it in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The poor in spirit. Did the Jews think that they were poor in spirit? No. We're God's chosen people. We get everything going for us. We're doing it all right. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives. This is a slavery imagery. We're not slaves. The Jews said, we've never been slaves to anybody. Jesus said, whoever commits sin is a slave to sin. They are captive to their passions and their pleasures. If an emotion hits them, they just react upon it. They have no self-control. They do what they feel. He has sent me to proclaim release to these captives and recovering of sight to the blind. The Pharisees said, are we blind? You know, they were. We wonder sometimes, how can people be so blind? How can they not see the love of God and that he punished his own son instead of us on the cross? How can they not see that God really does love and care for them? But did you think that way? No, not until you came to the cross. At the cross where I first saw the light and the burden of my soul. And to set at liberty those who are broken. We don't need somebody to die for our sins. A Catholic lady who was a greeter at Sam's, whom I had known for a while and had buried her husband. I was sharing the gospel with her, and she looked me right in the eye and said, I don't need anybody to die for my sins. And the Jews were of the same mindset. We're doing just fine obeying the law of Moses. But Paul tells us that through works of the law shall nobody be justified in his sight. We cannot be good in God's sight by doing good things and being obedient, because we'll never be good enough, and that's why Jesus had to die. You've got to admit that you are broken. You cannot fix this sin problem. And there was a fellow that Jesus told us about who was rich. And he went to the temple to pray. Did you know that tax collectors were rich? Because they collected more taxes than they were supposed to. And they cheated people. That's how they made their living. And they were hated for it. And he was standing not far from another rich guy who was a Pharisee. And the Pharisee prayed at the temple and said, oh, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like other men, like this tax collector over here. And he started reviewing about how wonderful he was and how he obeyed the law of Moses. And the rich tax collector, who thought he was spiritually poor, would not even lift his eyes up to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, be propitious to me, sinner that I am. That's from propitiation, which means you, Lord, need to satisfy your own anger against me because I'm broken and I cannot do it. I need you. This is the kind of people that get God's mercy. Alas, and did my Savior bleed, and did my sovereign die, would he devote that sacred head? And the original words were, for such a worm as I. They have changed the words in our hymnal, but unless you consider yourself a worm. People call me, you're a jerk. And I say, you don't know me at all. I says, if you knew me, you would not call me a jerk. Because I would have to get at least 5 promotions to get up to the level of jerk. Because I am that bad. And if I were not such a scuzzy worm, if there were anything in me at all that was admirable, then God could take that and develop it and make me better. But there was, as Paul says, dwelling in me no good thing at all. And I needed Jesus Christ to do it all for me because I was broken. And the tax collector who paid at the temple said, you've got to do it, God, because I'm broken. This is a problem in the churches. And Jesus addresses this problem to the church of Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3. For you say, I'm rich and I've prospered and I need nothing, not knowing, because they're blind, that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Folks, anytime you look down upon another Christian or even somebody out in the world and say, man, at least I'm not that bad, just remember that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately corrupt. And you are, and I am. And that if I weren't, Jesus would not have had to have died on that cross. You remember our friend Larry the leper? Leprosy in the Old Testament is a type. It's a picture of our sinful, decrepit, deteriorating condition. We can't cure ourselves. It must be the Lord. And the good news is the Lord came to seek and to save that which was lost, not the people who think that they're found. Jesus said, I came to doctor the sick, not the well. And Paul says, it is a worthy statement that the Lord came into the world to save sinners. And I am one of those sinners. And that's who gets God's mercy.